So a few years ago, I built this lamp, and I decided to make it coal-powered. Now that a few years have passed, I think it's time to find a new power source. I started by taking an old IKEA lamp and smashing it with a hammer. Then, I took a piece of wood that I planned to use as the base and attached a rudimentary wooden structure to it. On top of that structure, I placed the socket that I'd salvaged from the lamp. After securing the cable with some wires and an appropriate-looking piece of plastic, I attached a small piece of plywood and picked out a number of plastic gears from a sprue I had lying around and attached them to my wooden structure. I then painted a layer of black on the gears and the area around them. Once the gears were in place, I used a few pieces of pink foam that I cut to make the walls. Once I was satisfied with the fit, I scratched in a brick pattern on all sides using one of my sculpting tools. Then, I filled in all the gaps with milliput. My plan was to clad the upper half of the building with sheet styrene, but before that, I needed to calculate the angle of the roof using my swing arm protractor. It's a practical tool that I can't recommend enough. After cutting the styrene, I corrugated it using a paper crimper. It would have been much easier to use some of the pre-corrugated plastic that they sell in stores, but sometimes I like doing things the hard way. After that, I glued all the panels in place. For the roof, I needed a hole to allow the lamp to go through it. To achieve that aim, I used a compass cutter to cut a small circle. Once that was done, I glued down a layer of black construction paper. This was partly meant to prevent light leaks, but it also helped give me a more even surface area to glue the roof to. Now, when I glued the side panels to the wall, I accidentally used the wrong adhesive, which caused some damage to both the siding and to the foam brickwork. I partly covered this up in a few spots by strategically adding some technical-looking bits and pieces to the wall, and then I repaired some of the damage done to the brickwork with milliput. Now it was time to paint the building. I started out by painting the bricks a light gray and stippled on a darker shade to pick out individual bricks. Once that was done, I came back with some oils to smooth out the texture. I finished with an oil wash to simulate some weathering and stuff. To paint the siding, I started out by painting a metallic undercoat and then painted over that with blue. Then, after highlights, I dry brushed some metallic silver in a few select areas. I then used Tamiya texture paint to add some texture to areas where I planned to show corrosion. Then came a layer of metallics, followed by some rust-colored oil washes, and then I used an even thinner wash to get some streaking effects. Now, since this lamp was to be powered mechanically, I needed to build a mechanism that would allow this machine to be powered manually. I started with two plastic gears that I glued together at a right angle, that I then drilled a hole into the end of a wooden dowel and made a small wire loop so that I could feed a small brass rod through it. The next step was to file a groove into the dowel, and then rested a smaller dowel in that groove, glued it, and wrapped some string around the joint. After that, I glued down a few pieces of cork to the base. Now, I was ready to install the capstan. To anchor it, I used a small brass tube as a sleeve and a piece of corrugated styrene, which I wrapped around it and then filled with some epoxy putty. Then, I spread some putty on the ground around the capstan. After spreading it around generously, I set to work making hoof prints in the ground. The next thing to do was to add some texture, which I did with Tamiya texture paste. Then, I applied Celluclay around the edges where I'd placed the bits of cork. And after adding some dried out tea leaves for texture, I painted the groundwork. I then painted the corrugated plastic around the base of the capstan silver and weathered it in much the same way that I had with the building. Once that was done, I added some tufts of grass around the edges. To do this, I first applied some flocking, and then added another layer of matte medium and used that to glue down some static grass. Now, of course, I needed to power the mill somehow. After looking through available model kits, I settled on this water buffalo from Gecko Models. These animals are often still used in agriculture throughout South Asia and Southeast Asia. So with that, I decided that this scene will take place in Sri Lanka. And so I assembled the buffalo as indicated in the instructions. Once it was all put together, I started painting the buffalo. I painted him black with a few brown flecks and some lighter gray fur around his feet and a few other places. After that, I made a yoke by bending a piece of wire and wrapping some string around the ends. Now I needed some plants. To start with, I wrapped a thin wire around a thicker one, occasionally making loops. Then I coated the trunk with putty for texture and cut the loops and shaped them into branches, and then glued the leaves onto the branches. This bush wasn't really based on a particular plant, but it suited my needs. The next plant I made was a banana tree. I started by taking a piece of masking tape and folding it lengthways over a wire. Then I cut the tape into a leaf shape and bent the wire to get a drooping shape. Once I'd had a few leaves, I attached them together with some putty, which I shaped around the trunk. While that was curing, I took a rolling paper, which I tore up a little bit, and then licked it, and wrapped it around the trunk of the tree. Then I painted it, and then I painted the leaves. Next, I built a cable spool. I started by using a compass cutter to cut a pair of plastic circles and glued on some coffee stirrers that I'd cut to shape. To make the middle section, I cut up a cheap Swiffer feather duster. After gluing it to the bottom section, I glued on some more wood planking. Then, I glued on the top, and I was ready to move on to the figure. Then I started sculpting the figure. This time around, I started from scratch using wire and putty. I planned to have them sit on the spool, so throughout the sculpting process, I tested to see how they'd fit together. When I added arms, my main priority was to define where the shoulders were going to be. Once that had been established, I coated the wire with green stuff and began to flesh things out a little with milliput. I didn't really feel like sculpting feet this time around, so I borrowed a pair from an old figure. He wasn't going to miss them. I smoothed out the leg by blending it in with some green stuff and milliput, and then continued to flesh out the figure with milliput, trying to capture all the basic muscle groups. Then, I took a head from the pile of heads that I'd sculpted earlier and attached it to the figure. Now, since this was to be a Sri Lankan scene, I decided to have the figure wear a sarong, which is commonly worn in that part of the world. As a result, I needed to place a milliput between his legs to give the garment a little bit of structure and foundation. To make the sarong, I took a blend of green stuff and milliput and spread it over his lap, making sure to follow the contours of his legs and maintain some definition and shape. Then, with a silicone shaper, I pushed in the folds of the cloth. I decided to have a go at sculpting his hands this time around, so after winding thin copper wire down the arms, I bent the big wire to allow it to hold something. Then, I coated the arm with green stuff. Once that was done, I got to work on his shirt. Since it was to be a button-down number, I started by sculpting the left side and then the right. Once both sides were sculpted, I stamped in some buttons with a syringe tip. Then, with both sides of the shirt sculpted, I placed a teacup in his hand. Then I started shaping tiny blobs of resin around the wire to form his hand. It's not easy to do at this scale, but having the figure hold something helps mitigate the challenge a little bit. The left hand was a bit harder, but after giving him a cigarette, I could honestly say that his hands were full. After that, I gave him some sleeves. I decided to have him wear a turban, so I sculpted one. And now, he was ready for paint. After a quick zenithal, I painted his face using flesh tones that I'd mixed from primary colors. I feel like this approach has worked best for me when I've tried painting darker skin tones. Then, I started painting his shirt and his turban. I'd decided to make his shirt and sarong plaid since I felt that I needed a bit more practice painting patterns. I was also very happy to find that the cable spool I'd made earlier actually turned out to be a pretty decent painting stand. Now, painting plaid or tartan is a bit of a challenge, but I honestly enjoy it. A simple grid pattern is fairly easy to do, and with some pre-shading, it's not too difficult to make it look good. I just tried to paint my lines straight, and I hope for the best. After I was reasonably satisfied with how I looked, I brushed an oil wash to bring out some of the shadows. And now it was time to put everything into place. I slipped the yoke I'd made over the buffalo's head and then harnessed it to the capstan. Then I planted the banana tree. After that, I placed the figure next to the building. All the while, I filled in the spaces that I needed to with static grass and found a suitable home for my remaining bushes. At this point, I was prepared to say that I was done. Overall, I enjoyed making this project and I'm happy with the outcome. I'll probably make another lamp at some point in the future, as soon as I come up with a suitable idea. I hope you all enjoyed this, and I'll be back with another project whenever that's done.